Welcome back to International Finance. I am Andy Kim of SKKU, and today we are going to discuss balance of payment, chapter 3 of Eun, Resnick, and Chulu in International Financial Management. Now, what is this balance of payment about? The way I remember is about import and export, like this picture over here, plus some capital movement, plus and minuses, investments, FDI, portfolio investments, and there would be some, going outflow and inflow from foreign countries. What's net balance of it? Not just the balance of it, but it's dynamically, right? Over a period of time, how much, what were we exporting more as opposed to importing, right? And then investing more into the outside world than getting investment from outside foreign countries, right? Net, how much, right? Were we performing in country by country comparison we are trying to do? And with that, right, we're going to have some surpluses or deficits. Depending on the situation, our currency has to be depreciated or appreciated because the other currencies will be in more or less of a demand, depending on the excess or the surplus or deficit situation. So year by year, country's performance is measured over here. That's the way I understand it. Like an income statement in double entry bookkeeping way of understanding it. Okay, so let's go here. Balance of payment. This is the statistical record of a country's international transactions over a certain period of time, presented in the form of double entry bookkeeping. Okay, 복식부기, right? In Korean terminology, 복식부기, right? If you want to learn Korean language, here is one. 복식부기, yes. Double entry bookkeeping, right? Well, so debit and credit, we're going to talk about that part. And this is important to study for a few reasons. Number one, because it provides detailed information concerning the demand and supply of a country's currency. Okay? When you export, okay, more than import, right? Let's say you export more of a DRAM to United States, right? DRAM is Korean product. They buy it over there. To purchase that from the US perspective, they need to buy it in Korean won, so they have to convert their US dollars into Korean won, okay? So the Korean won will be in more demand than US dollars relatively, as the US imports much more DRAMs, so that the Korean won will be appreciating more, okay? The trade deficit or the surpluses will influence a lot about your FX rate. Number two, it may signal its potential as a business partner for the rest of the world. Well, what do you mean about that? Well, the way I understand it is currency crisis, like a Mexican peso crisis in 1994. As you import more and more, right? Let's say Korea imports so many iPhones, right? As opposed to exporting, then they will have to buy it in US dollar terms, so that the US dollar will be much more demand than Korean won, which means Korean won's value will be depreciating over time. But the currency reserves in the central banks, they try to maintain stable FX rate. Okay, Bank of Korea, they try to maintain stable FX rates to facilitate international trades going further, right? So to keep that FX rate stable and preventing those depreciation of Korean won, what would they do? They will sell US dollars and buy Korean won, increase the demand of Korean won to keep it up, okay, instead of letting it depreciate, right? Now, as long as the Bank of Korea keeps those enough of US dollar reserves in their vault, right? They can afford to do that, right? As long as they have enough of US dollar reserves, currency reserves. But what if not? Okay, what if not? What if they run out of currency reserves? Then they will have to let this Korean won depreciate like crazy. That's called currency crisis, which we experienced in 1997 and 8. Let me take you to that graph over here, investing.com. By the way, how is your Korean dollar versus Korean won versus US dollar performing? You can check it out every day, real time in investing.com. And you see over here, US dollar / Korean won overview. And then let me take you to maximum over here. Holy cow, you would say, what is that spikiness over here? That's 1997, right? For each US dollar, it was like 2,000, more than 2,000 Korean won at that point. I remember it. And then over the last year, how did they do? Well, 1 year ago, as this COVID-19 crisis unfolded, and then it seemed like this the end of the world, right? At that point over here, when it was spiking high. Well, when the crisis happens, what happens in the international capital market? There's a flight for safety. Flight for safety, what do you mean? Well, pull out those money, the international portfolio managers pull out their money from the risky market, which is emerging market, including Korea. I don't know why South Korea has to be still included in the emerging market, but it's there, right? Supposedly it's risky, okay? Let me take a step back. Perhaps the policy makers are not mature enough in Korea. Like if you look at the short sale ban in stock market and things like that, right? Recent issue is short sale ban. The policy makers are immature. Maybe they're too heavily influenced by this political who is in the rule administrative, right? Who is in the power, right? They're heavily influenced by that. Perhaps that's why Korea is in the emerging market still. Anyway, the important thing is the international portfolio managers pull out their money from the risky market and then run to safer market, which is US market, and put their money into the US Treasury and things like that. By that, the demand for US dollar increases, and then supply of Korean won increases as well in the international capital market. So that's why Korean won depreciated and like this. Depreciated, right? Is that right way of saying it? You may wonder. And yes, it is the right way of saying it, because this is really about Korean won per US dollar. So the nomenclature over here, US dollar / Korean won, is misleading. It's flipped, okay? So it is really KRW / US dollar showing up over here. 1 US dollar, 1142 Korean won at this point, okay? So COVID-19 crisis, well, with that panic, right? People are wondering, including myself, should I buy US dollar or not? Okay? Is the Korean won going to depreciate like crazy or not? Okay? Like the one we saw in 1997. Like it felt like it's the end of the world at this point, right? The thing is, over the last 3 decades, I say, right? There has been crisis and end of the world, seemingly end of the world 1, 2, 3 times in Korea at least, right? So now I believe that we are not going to die, or there's not going to be any end of the world, right? We are experiencing crisis every 10 years, right? The thing is, the most terrible crisis happened in 1997 for Korea in terms of FX market. That point, our currency reserve drained. Okay, central bank's currency reserve drained, dried up. unimaginable thing. We have no more US dollar empty-handed, like nothing in our pocket. Okay? So that's why we had to resort to bailout money from the IMF. We're going to go over that issue later on in our semester. And then in 2008, those Lehman Brothers crisis, how do you say, subprime mortgage crisis or global financial crisis, whatever you label it, right? We had another quasi crisis. Our governments never recognized this as another crisis because they don't want to look bad. But another reason is the currency reserve was not drained that much. But if you look at the currency spike, FX spike, it is close. It was close, right, to the previous one. Now in 2020, right, 2020, which is last year, I was wondering, and people were wondering, are we going to have another crisis like that? It's been 10 years, essentially, right? Time to do that or not? But I looked at the foreign currency reserve by looking at the Bank of Korea, right? And I stayed there and then did not buy US dollars, right? It's gonna be okay. Number two reason, of course, I was extremely busy working as a 글경, or is that the 학과장, right, or the program chair of Global Business Administration last year. Extremely busy, so that I could not take care of my own money, right? So God saved me from that with the heavy work. I did not even bother to buy that US dollar, so it US dollar's value or Korean won stabilized over time like this. Okay, and then recently, right, since the beginning of the year, the US dollar value had been appreciating relative to Korean won. Why is that the case? Because what? Recently, the 10-year Treasury rate has been going up like crazy. What happened to US Treasury rate? Of course, over here in the crisis situation, central banks, including Federal Reserve and then the Bank of Korea, all around the world, they coordinated very well, as well as inside their domestic policy. They were doing quantitative easing, and then they were supporting, right, printing a lot of money essentially to support those small and mid-sized businesses that were hit hard by this pandemic, right? Giving vouchers, giving money for free to the people so that they could spend out, right? One way of doing it was keeping their interest rate artificially low, okay? Artificially low. US Treasury rate being lower than 1 percentage point, which was extremely low interest rate. So easy money, they borrow it, and what do? Well, hopefully they spend, they consume. But the thing is, they just not spend all the money over there. But instead, what did they do? The people like you and me, they ran to the stock market, and then you see GameStop, right? Skyrocketing, and then the stock market bubble took place, right? And it's been there. Number two, with this easy money, okay, what happens? Print too much money, then eventually you may end up with inflation. The concern of inflation feeds into those interest rates, right? Expected inflation is one important component of that interest rate. US Treasury yield naturally started to go up, okay? So that the US Treasury rate recently hit 1.6 percentage point, okay? With that, what happened in the FX market? Well, US 10-year Treasury rate is more attractive than other emerging markets 10-year rate, then what happens? Capital flows into US market, out of Korea into US market, which creates the demand for US dollars. So the dollar value goes up relative to Korean won. That's what has been happening over here. Okay. Now, how much of an inflation can you allow, or is it really inflation going on? And then Jerome Powell will have a say about it, and he's been announcing several things. That's something you could discuss in your presentation for the next class or whatever. Okay. Now, anyway, getting back to this important reason to study balance of payment, right? Number 2, I did it. Number 3, the balance of payment is used to evaluate the performance of the country in international competition. So, export and import, who is exporting more, who are more dominant figures, all these kind of things. You can see it in those numbers over here. Okay. And the balance of payment accounting, the concepts that we learn is over here, right? Roadmap of this class. We're going to talk about the elements of balance of payment account, right? There is current account and capital account and financial account. And there is something called official reserves account. I told you about reserves, FX reserve, US dollar reserve in Korean Bank of Korea's case, right? Or most countries talk about US dollar reserve because this is the dominant currency that we use in FX market or whatever important transaction in the world. US bank, right? The Federal Reserve, they may have other currencies, right? Euro or Chinese yuan or Japanese yen, British pound, right? All these kind of things, they will talk about it. Anyway. And then there is another item called statistical discrepancy. Why do we need statistical discrepancy? This is not like a company's income statement or anything, right? I have to shut my mouth up in 3 minutes. So let's go. Statistical discrepancy, right? This is there shall be some discrepancy in countries' bookkeeping over here because so complicated, so many people and so many companies are transacting here and there and there and there, and then the timing difference of keeping record is an issue, so that you cannot keep the record in a standardized manner in one time spot, right? Time period, strictly one time period. This is plus and minus period. No, there are many items. It's kind of in a gray area that cannot be captured in a specific time period. Okay, so there will be some discrepancies. I'm going to talk about that later. This is something you're going to solve for. Okay, solve for. This is a plug figure. Okay, it's like a 방정식 풀어요, solving equation. So this is an unknown that you have to solve for in this balance of payment accounting. Okay, once you set up the rest of them, right? The balance of payment identity, we're going to talk about it, and then we're going to talk about the balance of payment trends in major countries, and that's going to be pretty much it. So next video, we're going to go one by one. So see you.